Well, I mean, I think that for me, the number one reason is it's the best way to prevent hypocrisy becoming very common amongst religious people, because I think when people are forced to do something, they do it because of the social pressure on them. And it's very interesting to me that Islam was born in the crucible of religious persecution. The Prophet was persecuted for 13 years, and really almost for the entire 23 years, because they were still trying to eliminate his community well into the tradition. And the Prophet ﷺ, one of the hallmarks of his religion was religious tolerance. Instead of being xenophobic, they were actually xenophilic. And if you look at a book that Michael Phillips Penn recently published called "When Christians First Met Muslims," one of the interesting things is that we tend to hear from the Byzantine tradition, like St. John of Damascus, and a lot of polemics against the Muslims. But when you actually look at the Syriac sources from the heterodoxic churches, especially like the Coptic Church, which was considered by the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church to be monophysite. I mean, they like deiphysite. They like to use another term for it, but they were seen as a heretical.
The idea that Christ had just one nature, not a divine and human nature. Orthodox Christianity teaches that Jesus is both human and divine, the Son of the Virgin Mary, the Son of God.
So when the Muslims came into Egypt, the Coptic Church actually welcomed them, and there's ample evidence for this historically. The Muslims, as they got more and more power, became more and more intolerant. But overall, these communities flourished in the Middle East, and you have the Chaldean Church. And your own family comes out of one of the Eastern Catholic churches, but people forget that, like, there's several million Coptic Christians in Egypt. That the Muslims did not annihilate these people or force them to convert. The Quran very clearly in the second chapter in 256 says, "La ikraha fi din." There's no compulsion in the religion. And even though some people argue that that was abrogated, and there are Muslims that argue that that was abrogated, that's not the dominant position of the Muslim tradition. And the Muslims actually practice that. There's evidence in Fred Donner's book, Muhammad and the Believers, who's a very well-respected historian of early Islam. Fred Donner shows how the Muslims and Christians were actually sharing churches because there was not mosque space, and so they were allowing the Muslims to pray in the churches in that early period. So I think there was a lot of religious liberty, and that's why it's very tragic for me, the current climate now, where you're seeing these ancient churches that were there long before the Muslims, 600 years before the Muslims, that are literally being persecuted in places. This is one of the great blemishes on the Muslim Ummah that will, I think, go down in history as a great black spot in Muslim history. But I personally agree with Thomas Jefferson that whether my neighbor believes in one God or 20 gods, neither robs my pocket nor breaks my bones. But I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that people do have their own conscience, and that conscience sometimes will lead them to disbelieve. And that's the reason. And I actually tell the students at Zaytuna that in the end, this is not a dogmatic tradition. There's a dogma in the tradition that you can learn, but in the end, you have to believe it yourself. You don't inherit faith. You can inherit it from your parents, but real faith is not inherited. It's something that you have to believe yourself. You have to make your own personal commitment, and that can only come out of free will, because we also share the belief that the human being is a moral agent, has moral agency, and if they're compelled or forced to believe something, then they're foregoing their moral agency, and it just contradicts the whole idea of moral agency and the open invitation of God, because that invitation, in order for to be truly open, has to be open for rejection.
Yeah. So one of